Hi, welcome to our third section from Unit 1, which is Ancient Egypt. So this is one I think that most people are a little bit more familiar with. So again, we won't stop everywhere, but we will stop at the important stuff. So Ancient Egypt is divided into two parts, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Basically in the opposite direction where you would think they would be. Lower Egypt in the upper part, Upper Egypt in the lower. And that's because the Nile River flows this way. It goes up. And in case you didn't know why, that's because the Nile River starts south of the equator. All rivers south of the equator flow north. All rivers north of the equator flow south. So because the Nile River flowed in, I guess what they consider the opposite direction, the lower is the top, the upper is the bottom. The green area is basically the area that ancient Egypt covered or conquered or was part of during the New Kingdom period, which is their biggest period. So again, we're not going to go through all of this, but you are still responsible for all of this. Okay, so what we do need to know, there are a few things we do need to know that I wanted to stop at. So Egypt eventually becomes one place, and as it becomes one place in 3100 BCE, it becomes the world's first nation state. I remember I told you before, Sumer is the oldest civilization, but not the oldest nation. Well, Egypt is the oldest nation. It's official. We have our official oldest nation. Okay, and that happens under the Pharaoh Narmer, also known as Menes. He has two different names. One is Greek, one is Egyptian, who conquered both Egypts and placed the capital in the center at Memphis. 200 years later, hieroglyphics developed. Now, hieroglyphics is not really Egyptian writing, even though I wrote that there. It's Egyptian sacred writing. So Egyptians had writing, two different kinds. One was for priests and holy things and ceremonies and official documents and stuff like that, which is hieroglyphics, which very few people knew how to do, mainly just not even pharaohs, mainly just the priests. And then there was a thing called demotic script, which was basically more for everybody, everyday people, accounting, etc., stuff like that. The most important invention of the Egyptians for us in the modern world is they are the first people to figure out that there are 365 days in a year and created the 365-day solar calendar, which we still use. The Egyptians had a different January 1st. Their January 1st is our June 21st. And they did that because it was the longest day of the year, the first day of summer. And so it was easy to mark this is the beginning of a new year, because other than the random January 1st one, which is basically random because Julius Caesar said so, basically is why it became January 1st. So obviously there are different things that happened during the Egyptian period. Let me see if I want to stop at anything else. Here, I don't think so. We will talk about Hatshepsut and Thutmose. In case I missed Thutmose III later. Thutmose III is the greatest Egyptian pharaoh. He is the guy who did it all, built the largest Egyptian empire, conquered the most land, made the most money, had the biggest army. Egypt during its golden age was because of him. Okay, we haven't talked about what a golden age is, but here's a chance. The golden age is when a culture is at its most influential, militarily, culturally, economically. You could say the United States maybe was in a golden age and then period after World War II, maybe. But Egypt's golden age is during Thutmose III. Unfortunately, his grandson kind of threw it all away. And we'll talk about Akhenaten too in more detail, as well as Tutankhamun and King Tut, probably the one everybody's famous with. So Ramses creates the world's first peace treaty with the Hittites, and we'll talk about that a little bit because he couldn't beat them and he wanted to go down in history as being famous. What he did instead is went on to build stuff and temples and cities and everything else and put his name on everything so that everyone would remember him, since he was a failure at war, although he didn't lose either. So Egypt is going to be easy for us too, just like prehistory. It's broken down into 3 periods: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, just like prehistory. Old Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, New Stone Age. Again, the dates don't matter, but I do want you to notice that there is a big break. 2181 BCE is the end of the Old Kingdom, but the New Kingdom doesn't start till 141 years later. The Middle Kingdom ends in 1700 BC, and the New Kingdom doesn't start till 150 years later. Now that's important, and what happens in between those periods are actually called intermediate periods, is basically civil war. So this particular king died. He had like 30 or 40 kids and 200 or 300 grandchildren, and cousins and uncles. And when he died, he didn't pick who should be the next king. So basically they fought about it. They fought so long that they all died, and their kids were fighting about it. And while all of that was happening, that they're busy fighting about who's going to be the next king, other people came in and invaded Egypt and conquered it. The Middle Kingdom is the reconquest of Egypt by Egyptians. Same problem, unfortunately, in the 1700s, except this king, instead of having 30 kids and 300 grandchildren, had no children. And so all of his cousins, brothers, nephews, etc., all said they should be king. He died fairly young, so he didn't have time to pick someone. And you have another 150 years, basically, of civil war. But again, during this civil war, the Hyksos come in and conquer Egypt until you get the New Kingdom, which is the most famous one. Probably every pharaoh you know comes from the New Kingdom. Now, you know the pyramids, but you probably don't know who built them, and who they're for. But the New Kingdom is probably all the pharaohs you know, plus Cleopatra, who comes later. Again, I told you before, red words, definitely definitions for tests. Pharaohs are Egyptian kings. Vizier is basically the assistant, the vice president, if you want, right? Usually he was also the chief priest, head of all the religion. He was the advisor for the pharaoh. The Egyptians developed the dynasty system, whereas if you're the king, your family will become the king, right? Someone in your family. So usually father to son, of course, but a dynasty can be anyone in the same family. For example, sometimes the pharaoh died and his kid was 5, 4, 3, way too young to become king. So a temporary ruler would take over, called a regent. Again, generally that would be an older family member. Sometimes, though, it was the vizier, so it depends. So for the Egyptians, everything is religion. Everything. The reason all of their artwork looks exactly the same for the next 3,000 years is because even the artwork was religious, right? If you made a mistake painting a painting on a tomb, you would ruin the chances of grandpa making it to the afterlife. So you could not mess around and screw up a painting. So paintings are generally not signed by anyone because it was a job, not that you were an artist. And if you screwed up that job, you could get killed for it. So the Egyptians believed in all of that stuff. And the Egyptians had tons of gods, hundreds of gods. They are the first people to believe in an everlasting soul. They called that thing a Ka. And they believed in probably literally 2,000-3,000 gods. Some of those gods were local gods only, like only for that neighborhood. Some gods were all throughout Egypt. And again, we're back to that polytheism thing. Of the Egyptian gods, 12 were the most important. Of those 12, 3 are the most important. We're getting those magic numbers again. The 7s, the 40s, right? All those numbers are super important in all of these religions. The Egyptians are no different. During Egyptian reign, most people don't realize the real inventor of monotheism, the very first person who said there was only one god, is actually a pharaoh named Akhenaten. Amenhotep IV, who changes his name to Akhenaten, says he has a vision, and God came to him and said all the other gods are fake. He closes down all the temples, and for a little while he's king, Egypt has one god. They're the first ones that we know of. But he gets killed eventually because the priests are like, no, that doesn't work. Then we're all out of work and we're all unemployed. And they bring back all the gods. So the main gods are, again, here, but the top three are actually here in order for a change: Ra, Osiris, and Isis. Those are your big three. That's who I would put on the test. Other gods you've heard of, I'm sure, are Isis, Amen, who later actually gets mixed. So this must have been confusing. In the New Kingdom, they combined Amen with Ra, because Amen was the god of Thebes, which is where the New Kingdom pharaohs came from. And they didn't want him to become less important than Ra, so they basically combined Amen with Ra and made him Amen-Ra. Now, you might notice that I spelled it with an O here, an R-A and an R-E, and you might notice I spelled it with an E here. That's because Egyptian, just like Hebrew and just like Arabic, does not have vowels, only sounds. So Amen is sometimes actually spelled with a U because there is no correct way to spell it. It's how you pronounce it. But it is Amen because it was used at the end of every prayer, Egyptian prayer, because you said thank you to Amen because he's the God who created everything, right? And later the Jews who were in Egypt picked up that habit of saying Amen at the end of every prayer. And obviously from the Jews, the Christians took it, and they say Amen at the end of every prayer. It comes from the Egyptians, which is pretty interesting. So, art characteristics. The Egyptians have a ton because you had to follow all the rules or Grandpa didn't get to go to heaven. Again, fortunately for you, you only need to know two. So two things here that you will need to know: canon of proportions and hierarchic scale. Hierarchic scale is just basically what I was telling you earlier in the earlier recording. The higher ranking person, the bigger you are. Canon of proportions is basically all measurements have to correspond exactly. So since there is no ruler back then, there was no ruler, what did the Egyptians use as the form of measurement? They used the fist. So the fist was the standard unit of measurement. So however big you built a fist or drew a fist, then you used that fist to measure everything else. So I'm making up things here to make it easy. So if I drew shoulder to shoulder, it's 5 fists. Right? If I drew a head, it's 3.5 fists. So even if it's a small figure that's only this big, or a gigantic figure, it's still 3 fists across for a chest, 2.5 fists across for a head, right? I'm making up numbers again, but you get what I mean. You always will follow those no matter how big the thing is. That's, again, why they all kind of look the same, right? I have better definitions, but okay, so let's go. First big important work of art for the Egyptians is from the time of Narmer, the guy who united Egypt, right? This is him, obviously. Again, why do we know this is him? He's bigger than everyone else. This is one of his enemies that he's killing. He's already killed 2 others. Here's his servant, obviously smaller than everyone else. Again, not because he's tiny, but because he's not important. Now, this killing was inside a temple, and, you know, it tells the story, etc. But how do you know? The real reason you would know is because no one has shoes on. So see, the servant is holding the shoes, because when you're in sacred space, you can't wear shoes, right? So again, backside, a bunch of beheaded enemies, his soldiers, his general, him, right? And the slave, again, holding the slippers, the slipper slave, I like to call him, right? They think that in here was a mirror or a place for makeup. Hence, that's why it's called the Palette of Narmer. They think it was used for that. So I know I want to go through this a little bit more. So Egyptians, rich Egyptians, were building things called mastabas. There's these 1-story buildings where you went in and inside was a fake room, but you could pray in this fake room. And then in the back, dug through the top, was a hole in the ground where you actually buried the person. So the hole bring you to the burial chamber, right? And remember, the Egyptians' religion is really important, so they also really did believe when you died, you did the same thing you did in life, and therefore in your tomb would be all your favorite stuff. So your favorite games, if you like games, if you like fishing, your favorite fishing rod, right? Everything would be buried with you. They'd put a couple of fake things here to discourage tomb robbers, but the real stuff would be buried deep down in the ground. Unfortunately, somebody dug this hole and somebody put the stuff down here. So there are very few, less than 1% of Egyptian tombs that have not been robbed. And not robbed recently. Robbed during the same time they were built. So the construction crew went back and stole the stuff, basically, most of the time. Or someone paid the construction crew to tell them where the real stuff was and went back. Inside the mastaba, it's really cool in that there's a hole in the wall where you left food for dead grandpa. So once a week, you'd come in and leave food and water, and then you'd come back a week later, and the food and water would be gone because clearly grandpa ate it, right? No one was thinking maybe some homeless people came and ate it, or maybe, you know, rats and animals and whatever ate it. They thought it was grandpa, so every week they would come back and bring more food and put it there. So if we look at the mastaba as if we look at the mastaba as a starting ground, you'll notice this is a mastaba. The first floor of a pyramid, the very first pyramid, by the way, here you go, first pyramid, oldest known stone structure, oldest known artist. There's a lot of test questions that come from this. Oldest stone structure, oldest known artist, by the name of Imhotep. He took the idea of the mastaba and made a smaller mastaba, a smaller mastaba, a smaller mastaba, a smaller mastaba, and put them on top of each other and made a pyramid, basically. So this idea that you might hear out there about the aliens created pyramids and all that other silliness that happens, if that's the case, we have step by step by step how they built the pyramids. And they made a lot of mistakes along the way, as you'll see shortly. So this first floor is got the hole in the ground, and then the pharaoh's buried under here. And there's a little doorway on the side to get there. And then the rest is just all stone. Here's the whole complex, so you can kind of get an idea. So all of that was for the king. It's what he was going to do after he was alive, after he was dead. Different parts of it. So I just wanted you to kind of see what happened. So the next bunch of pyramids are step pyramids, but then you have the next evolution. This particular king doesn't want a step pyramid. He wants, Neferu is the name of the king, wants a real pyramid. So they start to build him a real pyramid. While they're building it, the angle is too steep and it collapses, and all that's left is basically the inside of the pyramid. Obviously, he comes to see how his pyramid's doing, sees that it's collapsed, isn't too happy, probably has a lot of people killed. So the next group of people start to build the next pyramid for him, and as they're building it, they realize about halfway up, they're doing the same mistake they did with this one, which is they're going to make the angle too steep and it's going to collapse. So they shifted the angle about halfway through, and figured the king wouldn't notice. And that's called the bent pyramid for obvious reasons. Obviously, the king came, saw the pyramid, clearly noticed, had some more people killed. Finally, the last of those 3 pyramids built for Sneferu, the next group of people are like, wait a minute, we need to stop starting out so thin and basically do short and fat. So you can kind of see in the picture, this is a much shorter, fatter pyramid. And the shorter, fatter pyramid worked out perfectly, and it did not collapse, and the king was happy. For those of you who want to see what the inside looks like, this is the passage you go through. Now, obviously, this is all modern, the wooden floor and the metal and the wooden bars to hold on, right? That's all modern. And this is the king's chamber where he was buried. If you're a little bit claustrophobic, I tell you don't go inside any of the pyramids. Take pictures and buy the postcards of what it looks like inside. This is really claustrophobic. If you're even a little, like if you hate being in an elevator, you will not like this. If you don't like bugs, you will not like this. There's all kinds of bugs. So the 3 most famous pyramids are called the Great Pyramids, right? So, and you have father, son, grandson, the same family. So the father is actually buried together in the same pyramid with the wife. The son is buried in the pyramid, and the wife, where is it? You can't see it in this picture, I guess. And the wife has her tomb over here. And then the grandson is buried in this pyramid and brought his 3 wives with him for the afterlife. But outside, not together with him. So together, just outside. Don't just bring one. Each generation, I guess, thought, eternity is a long time with the same person in the same building. Eternity is a long time with the same person, period. Eternity is not so bad when you have 3, I guess. I don't know. What can I tell you? But they are exactly lined up as the same as the Orion's belt, the stars in Orion's belt, or the Big Dipper, as we call it. You'll notice that modern Cairo is in the background. So if you're really lucky and you stay in Cairo, you get one of these hotels like the Hyatt or the Sheraton, and you actually can see the pyramids from your room. It's pretty cool. So what they did is, it's always that people were buried underground with their real stuff. They built a fake underground tomb this time and put the real one up, figuring they would trick the tomb robbers. But, you know, how long is that going to trick you for? You're going to go down? Oh, it's not there. Let me take this other path and go up. So what didn't trick them for long. The biggest pyramid is called the Great Pyramid. Okay, and the Great Pyramid is the only surviving member of the 7 wonders of the world, test question. The largest stone structure ever built, test question. It took 23 years to build, shorter than the 826. But there's a lot of reasons for that. Reason number 1, no breaks, unless the king says so. Reason number 2, 100,000 workers working all day long, you know, no 40-hour work weeks, no overtime, that kind of stuff, right? But they did get paid. There is one great lie about the pyramids, and the pyramids were built by slaves and all, etc. and so on. That's one of the greatest lies of all time. In the background over here is actually the cemetery of the workers who worked on the pyramids. And remember, I told you the Egyptians buried you with everything you loved and did in life. And in the cemetery, on the walls in many of these rooms, are actually pictures of the people building the pyramids. And none of them were slaves, and none of them were poor. They were all skilled workmen who knew where to put stuff. If you put one rock in the wrong place, this whole thing collapses. So this idea that, now, slaves probably moved the rocks from point A to point B, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying no slaves were involved, but the idea that slaves or the aliens built the pyramid is also stupid. Inside many of these tombs are actually drawings of how they did it. So this idea of, oh, nobody knows how they built the pyramids, is like, nobody that's not been to the pyramids doesn't know. But if you've been there, this whole cemetery back here, you go into any of these buildings, you can see, you know, Johnny building the pyramid, Johnny carving stones, and Mark, you know, moving the stones, and Miguel putting the statue up. Each guy doing whatever that guy did. So in front of the pyramids is the Great Sphinx, the largest sculpture ever in the world. Also a test question. So the kings in Egypt are generally put in 3 positions, one sitting on a throne. So here's one sitting on the throne. Let me see if I can get to the next one. So here you go, guys, so you can see those paintings inside the pyramids. The other is standing, walking into heaven. How do we know he's walking into heaven? In Egyptian art and later in Greek art, making your first step left with your left foot means you're holy and going into heaven, right? I want you to notice something quick here, because we will talk about this when we get to the Greeks, that the stone is not carved out between them, nor carved out in the space between his arms, nor carved out in the spaces between them, nor even carved out under his chin. That chin is attached. That beard is actually attached. And that's because these needed to be permanent. They needed not to break, because your soul would come back once every year to visit your descendants, to see how they were doing, your kids, your grandchildren, whatever. And it needed a place to rest, which is why the Egyptians did mummification. But the Egyptians were aware that sometimes mummies could get destroyed. So the rich people had backup plans. And those backup plans were these solid stone pictures of them, sculptures of them. And so it couldn't break. And the reason it couldn't break, and this is kind of funny, is because the Ka wasn't the smartest thing in the world. And if for some reason his leg was broken off, when the Ka came to rest here, you go, oh, there I am. And then he'd look, oh, no, oh, I had 2 legs. I don't have 1 leg, so I can't rest here. And wouldn't recognize you. So these are built to last for that reason, basically. You do have some of them that break the rules, but very rarely. And then the third way you could be a king is hunting. So like I said, sitting in a throne, hunting, and walking into heaven. Those are the only way a pharaoh could ever be portrayed. So then the next is that's all the old kingdoms. The next is the Middle Kingdom. We're not going to actually stop at much of the Middle Kingdom. Tombs changed from the Mastabas pyramids because it was too easy to find them, to these carton sides of cliffs, which basically would become the standard from now on. is the rock-cut tombs in the sides of cliffs. Harder to rob, but they still obviously had people that built them. People went and told. Those got robbed too, for the most part. Inside the tombs, again, buried with everything you like. So this guy liked to go on boats. This guy liked baked bread, so he has a bakery built with him, etc. Whatever you like was put with you. The New Kingdom, however, has still those cliff tombs and the mountain tombs, but every once in a while, someone felt they were important enough to build themselves a gigantic temple to themselves. One of those persons is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is super important and super famous to history because she is the first important female historical character. Not character, person. She's real. First important historical person. Female. She also is the first female pharaoh. So, do I have it? I do. Here you go. First female pharaoh, first historically accomplished significant woman. Those are test questions. This is Hatshepsut as pharaoh. I know you're looking at it going, wait a minute, that looks like a man. And that's because pharaoh had to dress like a man whenever she went out. Because pharaoh had to be a man, and the only way she could be accepted as pharaoh is basically if she cross-dressed. That's right, you heard me say it. She made an agreement with the priests that whenever she would go in public, she would cross-dress, basically, dress like a man. And so no one knew that she was a woman except those very closest to the royal family. Even the army which she led in a war thought she was a man, because very few people were allowed to get close. So the next big shot, I went too fast, to build a big temple to himself is Ramses II, and Ramses II is basically the ancient world's version of a couple of modern people who really think themselves important. So Ramses II, like I told you earlier, lost a war, signed the world's first peace treaty, and that wasn't good enough for him. He didn't want to go down in history, basically, as a loser. So what Ramses the Great did is basically made himself a god, built temples to himself. This is probably the most famous of them. Built cities. All the cities are named after himself. And then built other temples to himself and other temples to other gods. And also took temples that were already built and added to them so that he could put his name on them. So I'm not making this up. Over 50% of all the monuments in Nuke that were built in the New Kingdom have Ramses II's name on it. He put his name on everything. All those 4 statues you see in the front, by the way, including the one that broke, unfortunately, that's Ramses as a young man, Ramses as a teenager, which is funny, that's the one who broke, Ramses as an adult, and Ramses as an old man. It's the 4 versions of Ramses. Notice how big he is. He's bigger than everyone else. That's Ra, the king of the gods, bigger than him. That's Isis, the queen of the gods, bigger than her. The small lady between his legs, yep, that's his wife. Those tiny people out front, those are his kids. Inside the main hallway, you go down the main hallway, of course, more statues of Ramses. At the very end of the hallway, where you kind of see the golden glow, there's a golden statue of Ramses surrounded by mirrors. When the sun comes up on August 23rd, 24th, I always forget the day, it lights up down the hallway, hits the statue reflects off the mirror, and it lights the room, and that was Ramses' birthday. So that everyone would know it was his birthday. So one of the things that he added to is the Temple of Ahmanra. You can kind of see in this picture, mostly it's ruins, mostly it's been destroyed. But when it was built, and still the largest religious structure ever built, so you can kind of get an idea how big it is this little area over here. Just that little area would fit the Miami Marlins Stadium. So you can kind of have an idea how big this religious thing. That pool is part of the structure. Believe it or not, that's part of it. You can't even see the whole thing. That's how big the temple was. This pool is part of it. This whole thing is part of it. So this part here is the part that Marlins Stadium would fit in. These are just different parts of it. So you can kind of see a kind of drawing of the whole complex of what it kind of looked like. Oh, wait, that's actually, let me go back quick. You can kind of see how big it is. There's, some people standing. And this is So let's get through. Like I said, Egyptian painting all kind of looks the same. All the rules are kind of followed. Now, every once in a while, you'll see people breaking the rules. Like these people are completely facing forward, these two, for example. And these two are naked. But that's because these are musicians and dancers. And in the Egyptian world, unlike the modern world where musicians and entertainers are, you know, looked up to and famous, in the Egyptian world and the Greek world and the Roman world, actors, actresses, musicians, and dancers was like the lowest job you could get. Other than being a slave, of course. So they can break the rules because we don't need them to live forever is basically what they're saying in this painting, which is terrible, but that's what's going on. Okay, so Akhenaten, who is originally Amenhotep IV, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about him, is the one who is the first monotheist, right? He has a vision, changes the name to Akhenaten, which means, if we translate it, only son of Aten, only son of God, basically. Amenhotep, by the way, all the Egyptian names are Egyptian gods. Amenhotep is one who loves Amen, the god Amen, right? Tutankhamun is one who follows an eternal life, the god Thutmose. Thought. I always get his name wrong. Amenhotep IV changes his name to Akhenaten. He moves the capital out of Thebes to a new capital, which he calls Akhetaten, the city of God, basically, and basically puts all the priests out of power. In that small period, you have a little bit of break from the Egyptian tradition of art because it doesn't matter if you make the artwork right anymore. Grandpa still goes to heaven as long as he believes in God, or Aten in this case. So you have much more informal scenes, but it still looks Egyptian. You're not going to be confused, right? This is still Egyptian. But you'll notice the features are exaggerated. The masterpiece of Egyptian art, here you go, is the bust of Nefertiti, which comes from that period. And this is what I mean by more everyday thing. Egyptian pharaohs, remember I told you, could only be sitting on your throne, going into heaven, or hunting. Here's the Egyptian pharaoh sitting on his throne playing with his kids, right? So it's completely within the norm. So he's giving one of his kids a kiss, the other kid's playing with the mom's earring, the other kid's pointing at, at the other kid, right? So, who's King Tut and why is he the most famous pharaoh? So, King Thutmose III is the greatest, but King Tut's the most famous, and that's only one reason, and one reason only. And that's because his tomb was the only tomb ever discovered that wasn't robbed. There's a video there if you want to watch the opening of the tomb. You copy and paste the link. So he didn't do anything. He was king for 9 years. He turned king. He was 9 years old. So his dad is Akhenaten. When Akhenaten gets killed by the priests, they still want to keep the dynasty alive, so there's legitimate ruler. So they kill everyone in the family except for Tut and his sister, who's 6. He's 9. She's 6. Because pharaohs marry their sisters. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, but I should have. And so King Tut marries his sister at 9 and 6. They're not really married. It's 2 9 and 6-year-old. And obviously the chief priest is actually running things behind the scenes. And so the first thing that King Tut or Tutankhamun signs is a law saying, my dad was wrong. He made all that stuff up. All the gods are real. But he's 9. He didn't sign anything. Or if he did, they forced him to sign it. And at 18 years old, King Tut died. 18 or 19. Now, there's a lot of mystery behind that. Maybe they killed him because maybe he was going to go back to the one God. And based upon the art found in his tomb, it's certainly possible that that's true. Because if you look at the art in his tomb, it doesn't talk about any other Egyptian gods. But nobody knows for sure. Well, why is he so famous? Because how much gold they found. And since he was such a small, minor king who did nothing, conquered nothing, accomplished nothing, was really probably not even king, to find how much stuff he had in his tomb, makes archaeologists shudder to think what must have been in the other tombs of the greater kings and the more famous kings and the kings that lasted a lot longer time. It's probably the most famous work of art from that period, believe it or not the masterpiece, is the mask that was over his head. The shrine he was buried in, all the different things. So, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is the Egyptian Bible, for lack of a better word, a better way to talk about it. So it is not a book of the dead. It's not about being dead. It's actually about the prayers you say when someone dies. It also shows you how to make a mummy, how to mummify a person and say the right prayers when you're mummifying them. But basically, this is the last page of the book. And it's a good chance for me to show you how the priests stayed in power. Like, why would people believe this stuff and why did they stay in power? So basically, at the end of your life, you're brought to the kingdom of the dead. There's no hell in Egyptian life, by the way. I should have clarified that earlier. There's only heaven. So there is a punishment if you lived a crappy life, but it's not hell. So here's the dead guy. Anubis is the god of the dead with the symbol of eternal life in his hand. He's bringing him to find out if he lived a good life. So how did you know? You took your heart, you put it on a scale. On the other end of the scale, you put a feather. If the feather weighed more or the same as your heart, you lived a good life, which is what's happening here. The feather's heavier, and you get to go to heaven. The Egyptians believed your soul was in your heart. So this is not your real heart. It's your spiritual heart. And if your spiritual heart was pure and clean, then it weighed less than a feather, right? If for some reason this heart went down and the feather went up, this half crocodile, half hippo, half lion would eat your heart, and that would be the end of you. So that's the punishment. Your soul would be eaten. So you don't get to come back to earth to see your kids, your grandchildren, etc., descendants, and you don't get to go to heaven with Osiris, which is what's happening here at the end. Horus, the son of Osiris, is presenting you to the god Osiris, the king of the gods, and now you're going to be in heaven and live happily ever after. But if you did it wrong, this beast would devour your heart and you wouldn't get to live forever. So they didn't really have a hell, but they had, your punishment was you don't get to exist anymore. I think that might be the last of the Egyptian things. So I did want you to kind of see what Cleopatra looked like, because everyone talks about Cleopatra. So there are coins showing you what she looked like. There are statues showing you what she looked like. And probably the most important discovery in Egyptian art is the Rosetta Stone. You probably all know the program that helps you learn languages. It's based because this stone has 3 different languages on it, and in each language it tells the same exact story. So it tells the story of Ptolemy V and how great he is, because Egyptian kings love to write about how great they were and what he conquered and what he did. And it's in Greek, and then it's in Demotic, and then it's in hieroglyphics. So because of this rock and the discovery of this rock, they already knew how to read Greek. They already knew how to read Demotics. Nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics. Once they figured out those 2 stories were the same, they realized the 3rd story was the same and were able to figure out hieroglyphics. The guy who did it is a French guy, one of the Jean Champignon, which basically means John Mushroom, which is a great name, Johnny Mushroom. I think that's the end for Egypt. I'm pretty sure that's the end for Egypt. And that's it. We will end. It's not really the end of Unit 1, but it's the end of this series of lectures. The end of Unit 1 actually starts with the beginning of Unit 2, which is Aegean Greece, which we'll cover next week.